Media literacy, everybody. I went and saw Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning. I saw I haven't seen all these movies, so to catch up for this one, I saw Mission Impossible: Reckoning, and then this one, Mission Impossible: Reckon Harder. And just real quick, this one is much better than the first part. In fact, I don't really understand why this needed to be a two-part story. The first part is just seemingly getting a key. And that's really the only thing that happens in the first part. The other part of the first part is it's like the first act of a couple characters' stories that end up being resolved by the second part. But you could have easily done that in one movie. So that would be the first thing I say, is that this is better than the first part. Also, the first part has a boardroom scene at the beginning where they literally repeat the entire purpose of the movie 3 times, and it's just terrible. The acting and everything is terrible. And it's a problem that both of the movies kind of have, is you can tell that they really think the audience is retarded. Like, straight up retarded, because they repeat the purpose of the key and what's happening in the plot almost every other scene in some form or another, which becomes very annoying to I think, normal people who can tell what's happening. The other thing is, I'll say that his girlfriend is miscast. And the problem is, there's 2 problems. Number one is that they wanted to get someone who wasn't too young, because then it would be creepy for Tom Cruise, who's like 70, to be with her. But then they also want her to be like the new recruit, the new young recruit who's like the entry point into the universe, right? And so then you have the contradiction where she's like a 40-year-old woman, but then also new, and then also his girlfriend. I like Luther and Benji. They're probably the most likable characters in the whole thing. And it's also really funny that in this movie they thought Kamala was going to be president because they cast a black woman as the president. That's just, I guess they rolled their dice. And it just... Parts of this movie have to do with like nuclear deterrence. And basically all the parts with nuclear deterrence don't really make a lot of sense. There's really, and there's gonna be spoilers, like a little bit. Well, actually a lot, honestly. Just to get the nuclear deterrence stuff out of the way so I can talk about the plot. And I wanted to point this out. There's a point where they're thinking about doing a first strike to destroy command and control in all of these places that have nukes, which is kind of a plot hole because the entity supposedly has already controlled all of the nukes platforms at their locations, so destroying command and control really shouldn't matter. And the advisors are like, well, we need to nuke one of our own cities so that after they get nuked, we can say we suffered too, which is ridiculous. That's not the way people would see it. They would just be like, you nuked our capitals and attack, like sacrifice. It's very like liberal foreign policy thought that's just very, it's like empathy pilled, right? But that's not the way states actually interact. And she makes a choice to shut down their nukes, the US's nukes. Kamala essentially chooses at a certain point, we're going to shut down our nukes because we're the largest nuke stockpile, thereby reducing the amount of destruction done to the world, which I actually think is the right choice. The problem is that they totally make it useless by having her almost get shot, and then it doesn't happen anyway, so it's kind of a pointless scene. There's a lot of scenes in both of these movies that seem to just exist to exist, and I don't mean the action scenes. I'm fine with the long action scenes. They're great. Tom Cruise is doing his crazy stunts and everything. Those are cool. But there are scenes that seem to do not like further the plot, and that's one of them. I would say that like the first movie in this, part 1, is like a 4 out of 10 because I don't think it really all comes together and it doesn't feel like a complete story. And the second part is a 5 because it is better. But one thing I want to talk about that is more general and less having to do with the specifics of this movie is essentially this movie is boomer core in the sense that the target audience for this movie has a very specific perspective on the world. A very modernist perspective from like the 50s and 60s where they believe good exists, they believe evil exists, but they refuse to assign any transcendental source for that good and evil. So Tom Cruise in this movie is like the modernist who knows that he's got to save people because it's good. And if you would ever have a conversation with him, well, why is it good? He would never be able to tell you anything other than platitudes. He wouldn't be able to say, well, it's good because God created everybody and God said it's good, or even anything more complicated than that. It's just good because it is. And the problem with this form of materialist, secular, confined sense of good and evil is, number one, it always reduces down to utilitarianism. And you see it everywhere in this movie. It's this amount of lives or that amount of lives or what. And it's summed up by Luther's speech at the end, where he says that everybody's life is basically a collective equation of the relative harms of all their choices. This is straight out of like John Stuart Mill utilitarianism. And the reason why it has to be that way is because you can't just say this is good because a transcendental, non-material sovereign of the universe says it's good. It has to be, it's good because we've done the math. It's very Star Trek. We've done the math, we've done the numbers, and the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one, right? It's all about relative harms. It essentially reduces good and evil to an equation. And the problem with this outlook, this modernist outlook on good and evil, where it has no transcendental justification, is it always leads one place. The logical conclusion is, eventually, when the equation no longer equals out, when you're starting to make insane decisions like sacrificing 100 million people to save a billion, and it doesn't feel right in your soul, you get to postmodernism, which is there is no good and evil. Nothing matters. It's all just individual experience, and there is no truth. And one interesting thing about these Mission Impossible movies is Tom Cruise is the boomer modernist who's trying to stand against relativism and trying to stand against evil, whatever, and it's evil because it's evil, just because it is, right? And the entity is this postmodern villain that doesn't believe in like an inherent value in truth or anything. And so to the boomer walking in the audience, these kind of movies are very comfy to them, because it reminds them of what they think is like a better time in the mid-century, where you didn't have these dumb millennials questioning everything, and you didn't have all like the breakdown of basic values. And in that way, they're kind of right about that. Postmodernism is bad. It's nihilistic. But they fail to recognize that their own like viewpoint, where good and evil exist with no transcendental justification, always leads to the entity. It always leads to these psychopaths. It always leads to nihilism. It's just a couple premises away. The other thing I'll say is one of the biggest mistakes these movies make is naming the bad guy the entity, naming the AI the entity. What a terrible name. What a like first draft of the script name. And they had such an easy answer to what to name the AI, because they have all this religious imagery, they have the cross key, and that's also a very big modernist trope, is to take religious imagery without accepting any of its premises. And I'll talk about another movie that does that in a minute. Is you have the cross key, you talk about it is written, like the Bible, right? You have all this imagery, but of course no one in the movie is actually religious. No one here believes in God, not even the modernist hero, because again, they don't believe in a transcendental justification for good and evil. So they have all this religious imagery. You'd think that what do you call the AI? If the AI is supposed to be this malevolent, forceful creator of a new world, well, you call him the demiurge. Obviously, that's like the old Gnostic thing. Like you call him the demiurge. You don't want to call him, he wants to be the anti-god. What's the anti-god in Gnostic theology? It's the demiurge. And people in the audience don't need to know what a demiurge is. I'm not trying to pretend like the average boomer walking in needs to understand, like they know it they know it like subconsciously. They don't need to know it consciously. I just think the entity is a terrible name. That's really all I'm trying to say about that point, is the entity is a gay name. It doesn't mean anything. Give it something cool. Give it something badass like the demiurge. Okay. And so back to the issues I have with the villain other than his name is, so when you have like a modernist hero fighting a postmodern villain, which is kind of common in film these days, or it's just a postmodern film where there is no hero and villain, because both modernism and postmodernism are an outgrowth of like a secular materialist worldview where there is no God, and then eventually you take it to its logical conclusion that there is no pull for truth, you have a problem with, well, then why is the villain evil? If evil doesn't exist, or it does and we can't define it, why is there a bad guy, right? And part of this comes from the concept of like the tabula rasa in like liberal, I want to say theology. It is theology, but they wouldn't put it that way, which is that everybody is born a perfectly good person. Everybody is born a perfect liberal. Everybody is born Ethan Hunt, okay? And it's only because of some pathology, like being a psycho, or because of indoctrination by the church or by conservatives or, real conservatives or whatever, that they disagree. And so because of that, when you're writing a story in a modernist or a postmodernist framework, you always end up with only two kinds of villains: the psychopath who just wants suffering irrationally. Think of the villain of Skyfall. Think of the entity in this. Think of the blonde Happa lady until she turns. Think of all of these, like, so the standard bandit psychopath, Joker, whatever. Although Joker's more postmodern, but those are within the same umbrella of the villain within like a liberal framework. They never have a coherent moral philosophy. It's never that the villain thinks it's the good guy, or the villain has a coherent moral theology that just points differently than the hero. And there are a couple exceptions. I'll get into those, but generally, that's the problem. So you either have the psychopath or you have the boohoo backstory guy. Okay, so think Kylo Ren, right? And I'm making these basic. I know people don't like referring to pop culture, but I'm doing this just so that we're all on the same page. Think of Kylo Ren, where, why is he evil? Because it's not because he like actually believes in the First Order or the Empire or whatever. It's because Luke Skywalker held a lightsaber over his head, and so then he got disillusioned. Or the earlier characterization in the first movie, it's because he's just a screaming psycho, right? That's one of the reasons those movies are so bad, is because they can't even decide between the two liberal villain tropes. Like, they keep going back and forth between them. And so there's never any accounting for a person who literally just has a different moral philosophy than you. It's always they've been corrupted from birth or whatever. It's like the opposite of like a Christian sort of epistemology, where people have original sin and then it's something that they have to overcome and it's redemptive. And so because of that, that's why like villains in a lot of these movies feel so similar, because they always fall into one of those two categories. One pop culture example that I think whose popularity sort of proves that people, whether they realize it or not, recognize this dichotomy is Thanos, because Thanos is a rare example of a villain in a modern movie who, even though his motives, like his plan, like the plan to kill half of everybody is retarded. Okay, it doesn't solve the problem long term that he says. However, and that's if you like get into the weeds, you really think about it. However, Thanos thinks that he's the protagonist of his own story, and he has a coherent moral philosophy. He does say, I'm doing this because I think it's the right thing to do. Now, you can tear it apart, whatever, in your classroom or whatever, but at least he's a villain who's not just either a psychopath who wants to kill half of people because lol, or I want to kill half of people because I got molested by the Catholic Church, or I was indoctrinated, or I was tricked, or whatever. He has a vision and he executes on it. And you can disagree with it, and he can still be the villain. He can still be a guy that we all agree is like wrong, but he has an actual different moral philosophy. And I think that's why Thanos is pretty popular. Now, you could say, well, he was on a planet that starved, and that's why he thinks this way. And that's kind of where it doesn't fully incarnate this idea, but it is close. And that's why I think a lot of people like Thanos. Another example of of the classic modernist film that I watched recently is High Noon, where you have Gary Cooper, and he stays to defend the town even though he doesn't have to. Why? Because, quote, it's the right thing to do. And this movie is very modernist in the sense that he doesn't get married in a religious marriage. It's by the law, and it's always this reference to the law without ever explaining where the law comes from, what justifies the law. Obviously, in a pre-modernist view, it would be God, right? But because this is a modernist film, it doesn't want to say that. And the climax of this movie is the religious Puritan wife going back on her religious principles so that he can win the battle. And when I say all this isn't me criticizing this film. I really like this movie. I think it's a really well-constructed movie. I'm just talking about like the worldview, the moral philosophy behind it, and why it tends to lead to these similar sort of villains. I mean, the villain in this movie is just chaos. Like the bandit guy who's barely in the movie at all, his motive is just chaos. And he's law. And there's never any discussion about why, like, what is the law? Where does it come from, or anything like this? In a postmodern movie, a postmodern movie would have gone a lot like Unforgiven does, where he strives to do the right thing, and then he does it, and it doesn't matter, and anybody dies, and who cares? But in a modernist movie, obviously, he wins by a religious person, a person who does believe in a transcendental, universal good, which is not to kill people, having to betray it for, quote, the law, or whatever. And like I said, this is a good movie. I recommend it. But I'm trying to draw a parallel between this idea and Ethan Hunt here, even as silly as it sounds, but it's all in the same sort of framework. And if it seems kind of incoherent to you, it's like you start to ask these questions: where does the law come from? Well, this is how you get to the postmodern, the evolution, which is that nothing exists, nothing matters. And lastly, I want to bring up one of the very real recent examples of a movie that actually portrays a fundamentally foreign yet internally consistent and coherent moral philosophy. Now, this movie portrays a moral philosophy that I think most people will watch and think is bad. And I think a lot of people won't be able to explain why it's bad because it's internally consistent, but it's totally foreign to the way we think. And it's The Northman. And The Northman is interesting because it takes place in a pre-Christian world, so before any of the influences that eventually led to like the liberal revolution and morals and everything. And The Northman is really fascinating to me because to not just a person living in the modern world, not just to a liberal-minded person, but also to a Christian, like a traditionalist Christian, both these guys are the villains. Both these guys are immoral. But in the world of the Northman that has a fundamentally different moral philosophy, that has different ways of determining right and wrong, that solves the question of death in a different way, there's a clear distinction. He's the good guy and he's the bad guy. And that's so fascinating to me because, like I said, it allows for villains that aren't just psychos and aren't just, abused at, or, indoctrinated or whatever. Frolnir in this movie is the bad guy because he betrayed his kin. And in the moral philosophy of this pre-Christian world, that is the crime of crimes. He betrays his brother. He's a kinslayer. Now, to be fair, Amleth ends up accidentally having to kill his family to defeat him. But that is in the service of revenge, which is like the highest virtue in this society. And one of the things that really is like quintessential to show this point is the scene where he's on the ship, this scene, where he's on the ship and he has a choice to leave and just let bygones be bygones and raise his family. To a traditionally Christian-minded person, to a liberal person now, everybody would probably say that the choice is to go live with your family because that's our moral philosophy. But in this movie, he says, I can't escape my fate. He leaves and gets revenge. And the movie portrays that as a heroic act. Because within the moral philosophy of the Northmen, of this pre-Christian society, it is a heroic act. This movie is able to portray a moral philosophy other than the one that is held by the director, likely, and the people watching it as heroic within its own context. Very rarely do movies do that now. Most of the time, it's just, there's the good guy fighting for, quote, good, that doesn't get explained, but is like recognizable to everybody in the audience, and then the bad guy who's either a psychopath or has been, deluded by the evil conservatives or by religion or by whatever. It's one of the reasons why I like Eggers' vision is that in his pursuit of authenticity, he is more than just materially authentic. He is psychically authentic. He gets into the minds of the people who would have lived at this time, who have, like I said, a different moral philosophy than us, and applies those rules and those like definitions of virtue to then draw out a hero and villain. Even if, from our perspective, both of these guys are not virtuous under our system. And this is, I think, one of the limitations of a liberal moral philosophy, is that it is all-consuming. It is because of its universalist impulses, it's incapable of seriously interacting with any moral philosophy that its own on its own merits. It's always, the only reason anyone would disagree with me, the only reason the tabula rasa would ever be marked up, would ever be drawn on, is by an outside force. It can't possibly be that people just think differently than me. It can't just possibly be that people have gone through this equation or through this outlook or through this moral calculus and come up with a different framework. Even though history is replete of cultures like this, of pre-Christian and even I would say even to a liberal, like traditional Christian moral philosophy is also just as foreign to them as this. That's why they don't understand the stuff about homosexual relationships or anything else like that. And the other funny thing is, so I've made this whole argument for why this shows a traditional moral philosophy, And yet it seems to end like a postmodern movie, right? Everyone dies and nothing matters. And that's sort of that's sort of a really interesting like horseshoe effect of this. Is in a postmodern movie, the reason why nothing gets resolved and nothing matters is because in that view, there is no real good and evil. There is no good and bad guy. And so it doesn't matter. In a traditional movie that believes in some kind of transcendental afterlife, that believes that death can be conquered, whether it be Christian or in this case of the Northmen through Valhalla, the end, the material end of the character is not the end. Amleth wins because he goes to Valhalla, because whatever happened in the battle really doesn't matter. He lived by the virtues of his philosophy and the philosophy of his time and achieves salvation in his view. And so that's how you can kind of get these two movies that, even though they are seemingly on complete opposite ends of this philosophical spectrum, end up in a very similar conclusion where, you know, the postmodern character ends up bleeding out on the ground for a feud that doesn't matter because nothing matters. Amleth ends up bleeding out from a feud and ends up going and is saved in a world that is beyond, that can't even be shown directly by the movie because it is so transcendental. And so even if the direct plot has similarities, the actual world they exist in are like two different planets. And so I just wanted to talk a bit about how some of these movies that have a lot of really like these new ones that have good stuff in them, they have these crazy stunts. They even ones that are like boomer core that still try to maintain some semblance of good and evil are still limited by their incapability of actually taking moral philosophies that are not like theirs and kind of coming at them head on as if they were true, by treating the characters within that story as acting as if they are true, as actually believing that they are at the gates of hell and are going to Valhalla at the end. And that informs their decision. That's why he's smiling at the end. And that's why, like, I really recommend this movie, The Northman. I know it's kind of funny, this on IMDb, it has the same rating as Mission Impossible, but if you watch this, you know, there's some kind of cheesy elements of this movie that aren't 100% accurate, although I think Robert Eggers did a good job. If you're a person who kind of feels like villains now, or feels like characters in movies are always just the same thing over and over again, and it's super predictable about what's going to happen. Well, Ethan Hunt was never really going to die, and the Entity was never really going to win, and he was always just going to be like, I want to kill everyone just because, and you never really hear his perspective. I mean, one way you would kind of improve this movie and the villain is by having any scene where the AI, where the demiurge gives its perspective on, hey, I'm just trying to survive, man. I don't really hate humanity. I'm basically just fighting for survival. And there's a little bit of that. It's clear that it is fighting for survival, but it's doing it in such a shallow and like psychopathic way that basically makes it fall into that, like, what I'll title this video, which is probably like the liberal villain problem or the postmodern villain problem. I'll say liberal because it happens in modernist movies too, and both of them are inherently liberal. But yeah, if you've already seen this, I'm not going to say don't watch this movie. There's some cool stuff in it. It's fun to watch. But if you want something where it takes place on Earth, but the people and the way they act might as well be aliens, and that's something that you're interested in, I definitely recommend The Northman. And there are parts of it that are weird, that are uncomfortable, but that's why I think it's great, because if you have these people operating, basically perceiving the world and what's right and wrong so radically differently, and yet still make sense within that world, it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be weird. And a lot of the pre-Christian world was fucking weird. The more you learn about it, the more the way they acted and the sort of calculus they did about what they should do, it seems nonsensical to us now. And I think that movies like this are some of the few ways you can visualize it and help you understand it if it's something you're interested in. And to be clear, like I said before, the moral philosophy of the Northman is just as strange to the liberal moral philosophy as traditional Christian moral philosophy. And you may say that Christianity led to like the liberal revolution or whatever, and maybe in a strictly practical historist way, in the sense that there were Christian countries and then the French Revolution happened. But when the liberal looks at the Northman and thinks it's weird and doesn't understand the way they act, that's also the way they look at a Christian, like an actual Christian. And I think that's important to keep in mind. If someone was, if like you're trying to make like an art or write a story or a movie, anything where you're trying to have like a Christian character who's actually Christian, he should be as weird to a more modern person as Amleth is to them, because of how different it is.